Hey guys, this is James with PS Audio. Been here, coming about 8 years now.
8 years.
So, yeah, it's been a good while. But I wanted to ask you what I hope is a quick and easy, simple question. But we get a lot of questions about folks when release the FR30s. People are like, can you use the Sprout to drive these things? And the power rating recommended for speakers is always kind of confusing for folks. So we have these amplifiers that are what BHK 600s, they are 600 watts into 8 ohms. Do you need that much power to drive these guys behind me? The FR30s. Why do you need more power? What's the wattage rating for a speaker mean? And then pairing an amplifier with them. Can you help me through that a little bit?
Yeah, I think these are great questions, and I'm really happy we're doing the stuff with our sales and service team here to talk. It's kind of voice of customer stuff. I know customers write Paul directly on this stuff, but this is actually sounds like a simple question, but is surprisingly complicated.
In depth, for sure.
Yeah, but power handling is something where I think there's a lot of misinformation in the market about it.
Confusion.
So, yeah, confusion.
Yep.
Yeah, and so confusion more than misinformation, but. Generally with speakers, you will see a sensitivity rating of the speaker, and it's done in a sound pressure level at a voltage. And they, instead of doing it at just 1 volt or dB per volt, they do it at 2.83 volts, which is 1 watt into an 8 ohm speaker, an 8 ohm resistor, I should say. Speakers are not a resistor, but and what how meaningful is that to someone? Well, if you're sound drops off at 6 decibels per doubling of distance. So let's say I'm seated 10 feet away from the speaker. It's going to be, if at 2 meters, it's going to be 6 dB lower, and then at 4 meters, it'll be another 6 dB lower. Yeah. You do get some reinforcement from the room. There is a reverberant field of sound in the room, but you're looking at something where, an average speaker sensitivity of 85 to 90 dB, you're looking at really only listening to a couple watts of power most of the time.
Right.
So for average level, but most of what your amp is doing in a home hi-fi setup is the dynamic peaks of music. Also, it varies a lot because it's dropping off half in intensity every doubling of distance. If I'm in a near field setup or something where I'm 3 to 6 feet away from the speaker, I need way less power than if I'm seated 12, 15 feet away for the same speaker, same configuration. Right. So it varies somewhat by room and setup. That's part of the reason people ask, what size room are you in? As a way to judge how much speaker and power you need, because it's referencing, how far are you seated from the speakers, that kind of thing. Music over the years has gotten less and less dynamic range in it. There are classical music pieces that have 20 dB of dynamic range, but most music is 3 to 6 dB, so it's fairly low.
Hardly anything.
Yeah, so if you're listening to compressed pop music, you actually need a lot less power than what you do on stuff that was recorded with a lot less compression. Yeah. So it's somewhat program dependent. And then also power ratings are funny because they're not. But manufacturer power ratings are mostly about damage. They're not about sound quality. So they're about how much power can you put into the speaker before it's damaged.
Without
causing harm. Because the problem with speakers is they're less than 1% efficient for a typical home speaker. Right. So 99% of that 100 watt amp is going into heat, not into sound. So speakers are not a very efficient way to convert electricity to sound, as a transducer, but it's not a problem. We have enough power now where generally, you can get high output from moderate sensitivity speakers and get good bass and stuff. But I would say to a degree more is better, because what you want is to get as loud as what you're comfortable listening to and what the music demands, because a lot of engagement, the emotional involvement in music has to do with realistic levels. So you actually have like a somatic response to if music is played back at a live level, where it's really engaging, and that dynamism is something that a lot of people look for.
That does make sense. I mean, that kind of goes back to what Paul always touches on is, headroom. You want to have headroom because, if you're using, 75% of that power rating in an amplifier, you're starting to inch your way up to distortion. It starts to sound
Exactly.
less, realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same goes with speakers. You want to make a speaker that can handle a lot more power than what it needs to, because what happens in a speaker is as it starts to heat up, it heats up really quickly as soon as there's a bunch of power dumping into it. And you can get dynamic compression. It's mostly not from the power. In professional sound, it is from the heat from the amp because they're playing it loud constantly. But in home, a lot of the compression is actually from other parts of the speaker, the suspension and the magnet and other things. But you do get some from just the coil of wire inside the speaker heating up. And so we, in our big speakers, have 4 2-inch coils that are spreading the power, around, and they have super high power handling, way more than what you're using in music listening. So
Gotcha.
Thermally, the woofer section of a Aspen FR30 will handle over 600 watts of power, which is more than, like on a continuous basis,
You would
which is
have-
more than you'd ever use.
Yeah.
The mid and tweeter, not so much, but the way that music works, the power demands are more at low frequency than they are at mid and high frequency. So there's as an industry, what used to be the Consumer Electronics Association, now called the CTA, they have a standard that they're starting to push for compression testing, power testing for speakers to say this is the maximum output of the speaker at a given frequency at a certain level of compression. I like that they're trying to do that because they're trying to have everyone rate things the same and have a standard that people adhere to. They don't really do that in hi-fi because, again, it's not really focused on sound quality. By the time you hit these numbers that they're rating, it's going to sound bad.
Yeah.
And so you never really want to get to those numbers.
Sure.
So I do think that people do focus on, because the problem is the speaker says, we'll handle 100 watts. So they're like, do I need 100 watts? Like,
What if I underpower?
What if I underpower? What happens?
Those first watt amplifiers, they were maximum 10 watts capability, I
Sure.
believe, and you're only using 1 or 2 of them. So why does the speaker say 100 watts?
Right. And it's more, again, based on damage, not on
Before you
requirement.
damage it.
Yeah. And so you can get away with a smaller amp a lot of times, depending on how loud you're listening, how far away, and then how sensitive the speaker is.
So I think that brings up a follow-up then. What about, if I plug in, say the speaker is recommended at, max 100 watts, but I feed it to M700.
Yeah.
That's 704.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Well, the funny thing is that is less of a problem than the other way around, because when you have a small amplifier that you try to push too hard and it goes into clipping, you're creating, instead of having a sine wave that's a nice curve, you're flattening the top and bottom. And what a square wave, when you square it off, it actually creates all these high frequency harmonics. That's what a square wave is a sum of a whole bunch of high frequencies together.
Right.
And well, where does that power go? That you've just, all these harmonics you created go right to your tweeter because it's receiving all the high frequencies in the system. So you can actually blow up tweeters more with a low power amp that's being driven hard, more so than a high power amp.
Gotcha.
And so actually having headroom in your amplifier can be less prone to damage, which is kind of counterintuitive. And I think it's
right? Yeah.
something that people should know. Don't be afraid of buying a set of M700s or a high power amp and using it on a speaker with a more modest power rating.
Right.
And just listen. It's like if something is distorted and your speaker is being pushed hard, you must be playing it really loud, number one, but you could just back off a little bit. Yeah. And there's nothing to worry about. Like you're not going to, launch a cone out of the speaker or something with the 700 watt amp. And it's just a good thing. And again, distortion at more moderate levels is very low because the way the amplifier is designed. So it's really well behaved. And so, yeah, power to a degree more is better, but it's something that people are really worried about. I think it's more of an issue in home theater because a lot of the power ratings on those amplifiers aren't correct because how they rate a home theater receiver, it might have 7 to 11 to even 13 channels nowadays.
Yeah.
And they rate the power at 2 channels driven, typically. So it's 150 watt per channel. amp. Well, it is when you drive stereo out of it.
Right.
Or maybe in some, there's really no all channels driven specs that people are publishing. They typically have half or less the power when they're driving all channels. And then you can get into that issue of, hey, the T-Rex is chasing the Jeep down the road in home theater, and you clip something into the tweeters because it's a bass transient, signal, but it then the amp clips and then it sends high frequency distortion. Tweeter blows up tweeters. So that's more of a concern than anything else. And so I think in those instances, yes, pay attention to what your amp will actually do. But with our customers, all the PS amps are lots of power.
Plenty of power.
And even a Sprout at 100 watts a channel will drive almost anything. It sounds best when it's not putting out a full 100 watt per channel.
Sure.
But it still is surprisingly capable, and it doesn't leave you much wanting there. And so, yeah, great question.
That was helpful, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Perfect.